Today's session is which oil you should be using for cooking and why. So many people say to me, I use olive oil for everything. I hear it over and over, and a little part of me thinks, oh, I haven't actually got the time to go into all of this. But to be honest, you shouldn't really be using olive oil for everything. Is it the best oil? Actually, it's not the best oil for everything. That does not mean it's not a healthy oil. And this is where I'm going to be explaining the difference in today's session. So it is a healthy oil, but should you be using olive oil for everything? In a word, no. And I will be explaining why. The reason that people get confused is that there are different oils to use for different jobs in the kitchen. So whether you're frying, roasting, sauteing, stir frying, moderately heating, it makes a difference. Because if you add heat to any oil, it will change slightly. If you add too much heat to an oil that doesn't tolerate too much heat, it can damage. And if it damages, that will cause inflammation in your body because your body can't deal with it. It's a damaged oil. So we need to try and minimize that damage so that we don't get any inflammatory reactions in your body or conditions. And minimizing the damage means using the right oil for the right type of cooking that you're doing. I'm going to be going through those oils with you so you have a much better understanding of which oil to use for whatever purpose you are using in the kitchen. So it's not just which oils, but when you use them and why. And I think then hopefully it will just be a little bit more logical for you to pick this particular oil because I'm doing this and that particular oil because I'm doing that. Before we even talk about specific oils, I want to just talk to you about the concept of heat and stability. Because when you heat an oil, as I mentioned, it changes. It changes structure. Therefore, it also then changes stability. So is it then a stable oil when you've heated it, or is it a little bit more fragile? And in which case, the bonds in the oil will break. So without going into too much detail of the chemistry and the structure of oils, imagine it as a long line of fatty acids. They're all connected with bonds. So between each one are bonds. Those bonds are susceptible to breaking, to damage. And that's what makes an oil fragile. If they break, the bonds are broken, the fat isn't stable, and it is then potentially dangerous in your body. We want to make sure that we're not damaging those bonds because we've added heat and therefore introducing damaged bonds into our body, which will then in turn cause inflammation. And inflammation within our body, if it gets out of control, becomes a problem, and that can then impact your overall health. So that's ultimately why it matters, why we choose the right oil, to make sure that it is stable. If it isn't stable and we've heated it too much, it will oxidize. It will also lose some of its nutritional benefits, and it will make those compounds then an inflammatory compound. And indeed, there are some oils that are anti-inflammatory. So what we don't want is to negate the benefits of eating good oils by heating them too much. So it's not just a question of whether it's a healthy oil, it's a question of what happens to that oil that is potentially healthy, like olive oil, when you add heat to it. That is the question you need to be asking yourself. So let's make that really practical, because at the end of the day, you're in the kitchen, you're cooking, you need to know which oil to pick, and that's exactly what I'm going to go through today. There are two types of oil. There are stable oils. They are saturated fats. Now, how do you know whether something is a saturated fat? It's quite simple. They are solid at room temperature. So let's think butter, lard, coconut oil, ghee. Those oils are solid at room temperature. They are saturated fats, and they are highly stable fats. So by stable, I mean when you add heat to it, they are stable. They are not as fragile, and those bonds that I talked about at the beginning are going to be more robust and are less likely to break. So saturated fats, they are solid at room temperature. Think butter, ghee, coconut oil, and lard. So your grandmother probably cooked with all of those things and everything was fine. And that's the reason. Everything was fine because they were stable fats. They didn't change composition. They didn't change in structure when heat was added to it. So they are the saturated fats. The other range of fats are unsaturated fats, and there are two types. There are monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. The monounsaturated fats are things like olive oil and also avocado oil. So olive oil we know and love as being ubiquitous in Mediterranean cooking. You know, everywhere in the Mediterranean tends to use olive oil, and it is a healthy oil. and it is moderately stable. So it's not as stable as the saturated fats that I was talking about, like butter and lard and ghee and coconut oil, but it is moderately stable, which means we have to just use a moderate heat with it. So you'll see terms in recipes, cook over a low heat, cook over a moderate heat. That's what we mean. We're not talking that fierce heat. We're talking a moderate heat. And I would say up to around that 180 degrees. So it's still a temperature that you would be using in your oven. So using olive oil for roasting is absolutely fine. But I would say a maximum of 180. That way, it's not a fierce heat that you're adding to that olive oil. We all know what happens when we add too much heat to an oil. You've popped some olive oil into a frying pan, you've taken a phone call, you've got distracted, and what happens? It's smoking. So that brings me on to a concept that you also need to be familiar with, and that is the smoke point of an oil. So the smoke point is the temperature that it will start smoking at. And each oil has a different smoke point. Saturated fats tend to have a higher smoke point. Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats have a lower smoke point. So at a lower temperature, they will start smoking. When they start smoking, that is when the structure changes. So if I'm honest, if you do see olive oil that is smoking, I would actually discard it because it has changed structure. It will also change taste, but depending on how long it's been smoking for, sadly, I would actually say I would discard that. So really try and be careful when at the stage of cooking you add your oil. If you add it just when you're ready to cook, that's great. But don't add it too early where it will heat up, you may get distracted and it will then smoke. Especially when it is a monounsaturated oil like olive oil, which is one that I know many, many people use. So that's something to take on board. If an oil has smoked, it is possibly worth discarding, depending on how long it has been smoking for. I don't like waste, you probably know that by now, but when it's going to change structure, then I think it could potentially have more toxic components to it, which we do not want. If you're worried about something like butter, which will smoke, we all know that when we put butter in a pan, it smokes. Now, bear in mind, what is actually smoking is the milk element of butter. Milk contains lactose. That's the milk sugar. The milk sugar, it's called lactose, with an OSE at the end, is always a sugar. And it is that is actually smoking, not the fat element of butter. If you are familiar with ghee, which you tend to use in Asian cooking, Indian cooking, Middle Eastern cooking, ghee is actually butter that has been heated until the milk solids separate from the fat element, and they are two different layers. And you can then skim off the milk from the fat, and ghee is just the fat element. So if you heat ghee, it will not smoke in the same way that butter does, because ghee is butter without the milk element, and it is actually the milk element that is smoking. So what I'm pointing out there is that ghee and butter as saturated fats have a higher smoke point, but don't be confused by the fact that butter will smoke. It's not smoking because you've reached the smoke point of the fat in the butter. It's smoking because it is the milk element, the lactose, that is burning effectively. Saturated fats like butter, ghee, lard, coconut oil actually have a much higher smoke point, which is why they tolerate high heats and they are safer to use at high heats. Whereas olive oil and to a certain extent avocado oil, they have lower smoke points and therefore you need to use them at moderate heats. Now, avocado oil actually has more properties of a saturated fat and it does tolerate higher heats. So avocado oil is an oil you can use at higher temperatures. It's much more stable and it is a good one to use at higher temperatures. It is a little bit more expensive, but I like to use it sparingly, and as I say, I can heat it a little bit more. So if I'm frying or sauteing, I find it's a really nice one to use, as well as butter, as well as ghee, as well as coconut oil. So that is your heat and stability, your smoke points, saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. So I hope that gives you an idea of the whole bigger picture of how to choose an oil and why. So now I'm just going to go through each one of those oils in a little bit more detail, hopefully to clarify for you and to make it less confusing which oil to use when you're in the kitchen and actually needing to make a choice.